if you want to take your art from this to this, understanding water control and incorporating water into your watercolors is essential. One of the reasons watercolor can seem so difficult as compared to oil or acrylic is because you're adding an entire new element to the process. Oil and acrylic artists have to deal with paint, their surface, and whatever they use to apply that paint to their surface. Watercolor artists have all that plus water. This is why learning about water is so important. And this is also why watercolor can be so hard to learn. You know that this course is called the Paint 333 program. We have the 3 properties, the 3 principles, and the 3-step process. And today we're talking about the 3 properties. If you've tried to learn about water control from other watercolor artists, you've likely been taught about the consistency of your watercolor that you apply to your paper. They often use terms like water, coffee, tea, milk, cream, and butter, I think, to help you understand basically how thick your paint should be before you apply it to your paper. But this approach leaves out how wet your paper is and how wet your brush is. So when I say 3 properties, which is what today's video is about, I'm talking about the 3 properties of water control for your paint, your paper, and your brushes. You can see on this PDF, which is available in the description, that the 3 properties of paint include water only, a weak mix, or a strong mix of paint. The 3 principles of paper is dry paper, almost dry paper, and wet paper. And finally, we have the 3 principles for brushes, which I labeled as dry, blotted, and wet. I came up with these 3 properties to simplify things and help you learn how to approach watercolor and master water control as we move through the tutorials on my channel. Most likely, if you follow other watercolor artists, they're not going to be using the same vocabulary that I am, and they're not going to be teaching about these 3 properties. And I bet you noticed that the 3 things, paint, paper, and brushes, each have 3 things about water control. I know I personally learn better if there's a little bit of a system, and I thought this system of 3s can help simplify things, and it really honestly will help me teach it better too. So feel free to take this PDF, print it out, and put it by your painting area. You'll see I've broken down each technique that we already talked about in the previous videos to correspond to the 3 properties that it involved to achieve that technique. This will be really helpful if you're painting on your own and you really want to do scraping, let's say, but you can't remember how wet the paper should be. You can reference this as a kind of quick guide to help you achieve that technique without too much thought. Now, as much as I like to break down watercolor into a system like this, watercolor is fluid. The way you paint will be different than the way I paint. Just because a certain technique on the PDF corresponds to certain properties of paint, paper, and brushes doesn't mean you necessarily have to stick to that 100% in order to achieve that technique. As you paint these techniques and practice, you will learn what works best for your style of painting and, of course, the supplies that you use too, which will influence how everything works. We have the 3 elements, paint, paper, and brushes, and each of those things has the 3 properties. So I'm going to go ahead and just quickly demo those things. But again, they are listed and images of what that looks like are in that PDF. All right, the 3 properties for your brush. Of course, we have a dry brush. There's no shine, it's just a dry brush. A blotted brush is dipped in your water and blotted on your rag. And a wet brush is straight from your water cup. Sometimes I flick off the excess water just so I don't drip on my painting. Now, there are varying degrees within blotted and even wet brushes, but for the most part, wet is a lot of water and blotted is like half the water. Obviously, wet paper is just that, wet paper. It's once you lay water down, that's wet paper. Almost dry paper is laying down water and then letting it dry till what it says it's almost dry. If you look at it from an angle against light, you should be able to see that wet paper is very shiny and almost dry paper is starting to lose its shine, but it still has a little bit of a shine. Dry paper is self-explanatory, just dry. Moving on to paint, sometimes we paint with water only, with just water. That is also very self-explanatory. I'm just painting with water. And sometimes we have a weak mix where it's mostly water with a little bit of pigment. A lot of the paper will show through if you're using transparent colors. And then we have a strong mix, which is mostly pigment and not as much water. Again, these two elements can also vary, much like a blotted or a wet brush, and you can have different degrees of a weak mix or a strong mix. But in general, for how I teach watercolor, I just like to say strong mix or weak mix, and then you as the artist can interpret how strong or how weak from there. This video is short and sweet, but a lot of the information is within that PDF. So it's more of an explanation of that PDF that you can use as a resource as you paint. Tomorrow we're leaning into the threes even more with the 3-step process. And I'm breaking down a way of working that considers edges, layers, and sections. If you have any tidbits of wisdom to share with us as we're learning this together, these properties of water control for paint, paper, and brushes, please let us know in the comments. We didn't do any kind of follow along paintings today, but if you're curious about the supplies I use, you can find all that information in your free PDF supply list at paint333.com. Happy painting, and I will see you in tomorrow's lesson. So we have the 3 elements of harmony.